Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our fifth in a series of 6 lectures on Jewish stereotypes. Before I begin, let me make an announcement, and I promise you what I'm about to announce is not taking place as I speak. That foot and mouth moment I'm only going to have once, I hope. No, I want to mention, as some of you might know, when I'm not doing this, I'm also directing the Cohn Haddow Center for Judaic Studies in Wayne, and I want to give you a little preview of 2 events we have coming up in the fall. Now, it's a few months away. It's kind of like a save the date, and next week I'll bring you a promotional flyer about it, but I want to put it in your head. One of them is on October 22nd. Now, Sunday evening, October 22nd, we're going to be sponsoring a Sephardic music concert, which should be very good. The woman who's the head of this ensemble, her name is Lisa Lee. I believe she belongs to B'nai Israel. But she plays Sephardic music. The actual concert is going to be part of a... It's the featured event of a conference we're hosting at Wayne that Sunday and Monday. This conference is called the Midwest Jewish Studies Association, where we bring in Jewish studies scholars from all over the Midwest. That's a 2-day conference, which you're also invited to go to. You're more than welcome. I'll give you some information about that. This concert is sort of when we have this concert, there's a kind of realism among academics, certainly Jewish studies academics, is that as much as we love sitting in those conference sessions, it gets a little, what's the word, somewhere between mind-numbing and oppressive after a while. So we need something different parts of our brain. So usually this is a keynote cultural event, this Sephardic music concert. So that's Sunday evening, October 22nd. It's going to be at Shaver Auditorium down at Wayne. The other one is going to be on Wednesday afternoon, November 1st. It's a noontime event. It's co-sponsored by the law school. I don't know if I mentioned this one before, but it bears mentioning again. This is an event which is sort of noting or commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which is November 2nd this fall, so it's the day before. And we're bringing in a speaker from New York whose name is Mayor Soloveitchik. Now, he's a member of the Soloveitchik family. This is not Rav Soloveitchik. This is his great-nephew, but he is one of the leading experts on American Jewish history, on Orthodoxy in America. He teaches at Yeshiva University. He's also the rabbi of one of the oldest congregations in the country. He's the rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, and he's going to speak on the topic Justice Brandeis and the Balfour Declaration, which is a very interesting story. So essentially, you're the first people who know about this. But we're very lucky to be able to get him. He's very tough to get, but I got him, and I got him on that day. I wanted to get him on November 2nd, but he has to teach that day. So he said, but I'll come one day before. It's just about as good. The 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. So I just want to put that out there, and I'll bring you some more information next week. Okay. Now this evening, in some sense, we turn to something a little bit different. The stereotype we're going to look at this evening is the Jewish mother. Now, I have to admit, I'm approaching this topic with a little bit of trepidation, only because I'm pretty sure out there's more than a few Jewish mothers. I know my wife is a Jewish mother of my children. So let me just start by saying from the outset, nothing I say this evening is about you personally. We're talking about other Jewish mothers, obviously. But it is a well-known stereotype. In some sense, it's maybe not as virulent as the blood libel or the notion that Jews killed Christ, but it is an important one. It has had certain implications and ramifications. It has caused certain difficulties and tensions. But I thought it might be useful just to start with 2 Jewish mother jokes. Now, like I said, I'm not talking about anyone in this room. So here are 2 Jewish mother jokes. So let me tell you the jokes, and then I'll explain the significance of the jokes, because behind the joke there's always some nice cultural resonance. So here's the first one. Which one should I do first? All right. We'll do this one first. A Jewish mother gives her son a birthday present. She gives him 2 ties. And the next time he sees her, to sort of show his gratitude, he wears one of the ties. And she takes one look and says, "What, you didn't like the other tie?" So that's one. The other one is a Jewish mother, the son is in therapy for a variety of reasons, whatever reason. And after a therapy session, the therapist says to his mother, "You know, I'm afraid your son is suffering from he has a bit of an Oedipal complex," which is a prelude of saying, So it has something to do with his relationship with her. He has a bit of an Oedipal complex, and the mother says, Oedipal schmedible as long as he loves his mother. Okay. Now those jokes actually reflect two different dimensions or two different aspects of this whole stereotype about the Jewish mother. The first one is the impossible, or the notion that a Jewish mother imposes impossible expectations. That a Jewish mother is impossible to please. The second one is all she wants to do is love her children, to the point of absurdity. And both of those, it's really part of the point. So the short version of this story, the short version of this stereotype is that the elements of the Jewish mother stereotype, in some sense, there's nothing original about the attributes or the characteristics of the Jewish mother, of the image of the Jewish mother. As we'll see, those basic characteristics had been the way Jewish mothers have been imagined, in some sense, since biblical times. But what was different about this modern stereotype, and as we'll see, it is not only a modern stereotype, it is a 20th century American Jewish stereotype, which is rooted in a particular moment. What's new here is not the specific characteristics themselves, loving children, high expectations, but magnifying and exaggerating those characteristics to the point where loving becomes hovering or smothering. So it's really, like other stereotypes, it's taking certain characteristics which are generally not only benign but actually wonderful and exaggerating them into something destructive and harmful. Now, that in a sense is the short version of the story. Let me also explain at the outset what do I mean by this is a stereotype tied to a specific moment. I'll give you the short version again, and then we can expand it a little bit. The short version is that the image of the Jewish mother, I would say, until early 20th century America, was almost across the board, globally, a positive image. And we will look at that in a minute. It's in America where, and in America when we transition from the generation where everyone is immigrants into that second generation of American Jews, second generation immigrants, this is when it begins to appear. And we can even point to the moment when we see that negative sense of the Jewish mother begin to appear. Look at your handout. We're going to look at the first three. We'll look at them side by side. All of these were written around the same time, give or take. And they're all written by American Jewish children of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So the first is Sophie Tucker. Now this is the English translation of a Yiddish song she would sing as part of her act called the Yiddish Mama. This is text number 1. When the house was full with the sound of children's voices and the kitchen smelled of roast and dumplings, you can be sure our house did not lack poverty, but there was always enough for the children. She used to voluntarily give us bread from her mouth, and she would have given up her life for her children as well. Millions of dollars, diamonds, big beautiful houses, but one thing in the world you get only one of from God, a Yiddish mama. She would have leapt into fire and water for her children. Not cherishing her is certainly the greatest sin. Oh, how lucky and rich is the person who has such a beautiful gift from God. You'll agree there is nothing pejorative or negative about that. That is very nice. It's also consistent with centuries of descriptions of Jewish mothers. Number 2, this is an excerpt from the film The Jazz Singer, and this is Eddie Cantor singing to his mother, whose character's name I forgot. Okay. What did I say? I'm sorry, Al Jolson. The two of them are exactly the same person in my mind, even though I know they're not. Okay? Sorry, Al Jolson. Mother, I wandered away, breaking your heart. Now I'm growing up, mother of mine. When friends all doubt me, I still have you. Somehow you're just the same, mother divine. With your arms around me, I know I'm not to blame. She's the only one who stands by him in the movie. She's the only one who really helps him remain and fulfill his destiny. Another positive description. And then we get to Irving Howe. Irving Howe compiled really a collection of reflections about the immigrant experience in America. some of which he wrote, some of which he didn't write. Here's one which he did write from World of Our Fathers. This is number 3. The Jewish mother was a brassy scourge, with her grating bark or soul-destroying whine, silver blue hair and unfocused aggression, daughters paled, sons fled, her groaning, cajoling, intimidating. Now that's not very nice at all. That's a very negative one. So the question we have to ask this evening is, chronologically, from Yiddish Mama and the Jazz Singer to World of Our Fathers to Irving Howe, we're not talking about that much time. Irving Howe's formative years were probably 10 or 15 years after Al Jolson's formative years, and yet, what a shift. So we have to figure out why the shift and why did it happen then. Yeah, I'll give you a little teaser trailer. It really comes down to, and really the impetus, the root of this shift is going to be the challenge of assimilation in America. I'm going to put that out. I'm going to explain it, but put it in the back of your mind. That maybe it wasn't what you were expecting me to say, but it's all going to come down to that. So that's the short version of the story. Let's take a broader look at what's going on here. Now, as I said, we generally speaking have very positive images of the Jewish mother going all the way back to biblical times. And there are many early examples. We could look at biblical examples. I think the most striking biblical example, it has to be obviously one of the matriarchs, don't you think? And the one really is Rachel. Now Rachel. So look at text number 4. Text number 4, we have a passage from the book of Jeremiah. This is one of Jeremiah's prophecies. Now chapter 31, this is Jeremiah prophesying immediately after the Jews have been sent into exile. This is a point when the Jews are lamenting the future. The Jews are uncertain if they're going to survive. They feel that God has forsaken them. So let's read this passage of Jeremiah and then a midrash elaborating it. So what does it say? Thus said the Lord, Kol Amar Adonai, Kol Beramah, a voice, a cry is heard in Ramah. Now, Ramah is a kind of double entendre. It's the name of a place in Israel. It also means height, a high place, so overlooking. Kol Beramah. Kol Beramah nishma nehi bechi tamrurim, Rachel mevaka al baneha. A cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. Rachel mevaka al baneha. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. Thus said the Lord, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears. For there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. They shall return from the enemy's land. Now even the simple meaning of this passage suggests to us that God is telling Rachel that Rachel is weeping for her children, the children of Israel. And God says, your love of them is going to be what ultimately redeems them from captivity. Now, expanding that, we have a midrash on this passage. This is text number 5. This midrash basically expands, fills in the gaps in that story. All of the avot, the patriarchs, and the imahot, the matriarchs, went to God to appease him during the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. None of them were able to appease God. Rachel came and said, do I have more compassion than you, God? This is her not only weeping for her children in the midrash, she is defending them. She is advocating in a very almost arrogant way to God, but in the good way. Do I have more compassion? Does a person have more compassion than God? Jacob worked for me. This is Rachel speaking, for many years. And at the end, my sister went under the chuppah and married my husband, and I remained quiet. I didn't complain. I didn't cry out. Do I have more compassion than you? God said to Rachel. To you, Rachel said. God said to Rachel, it is right what you say, and because of you, I will return the people of Israel to the Holy Land. Rachel is in this midrash. And even in the text of Jeremiah itself, she is the catalyst for redemption, but not her specifically. Not for a general range of righteous acts. She is the catalyst because she is the quintessential good mother here. And in some place, Rachel weeping for her children becomes the template for what a good Jewish mother is. And from this point on, subsequent sources are going to build on that. Let me give you another example. This is, these are examples which tell us that sometimes Jewish men can go astray and they need guidance to stay on the straight and narrow. So look at text number 6. Text number 6, we have a midrash explaining a verse from the book of Exodus. Now this is right at the beginning of the story of Egyptian captivity. The Jews have been enslaved, and we hear Vayelech ish mi beit Levi. A man, a Levite, went out. Now it's talking about Moses' father Amram. It doesn't exactly say where. It basically, in the verse says he went out and he married a woman, Yocheved. These are Moses' parents. But it doesn't explain what the text means. What does it mean he went out? It doesn't tell us where he went. It doesn't tell us where he's going. The Midrash is going to explain the rest of that. Okay? Now here's the backstory to why the book of Exodus says this man went out and got married, or married Yocheved. It says, this is the bottom of page 1. Aware that Pharaoh had decreed, every son that is born you shall cast in the river, Amram, meaning Moses' father, said, we labor in vain. In other words, if all the boys are going to be killed, if there's no possibility for a future, so why should I get married and have children? Now Amram was a leading figure, and when Amram said, I'm not getting married and I'm not having children, I'm not having a family, all the men followed his lead. Basically, his despair in the face of Pharaoh's decree threatened to end basically the Jewish people. Okay. Then his daughter, Miriam. And remember, Miriam in Jewish tradition is not only the sister of Moses, she is another wise Jewish mother. Then his daughter said to him, Father, your decree is more cruel than Pharaoh's, for Pharaoh has decreed only against the males. He's only killing the boys, while you decree against both males and females by deciding a priori not to have any more Jewish children. Pharaoh decreed only concerning this world, while you decree concerning both this world and the world to come. Now, since Pharaoh is a wicked man, there is doubt whether his decree will or will not be fulfilled. But since you are a righteous man, your decree is sure to be fulfilled. At once he went out and took back his wife, Yocheved, and all the other men did as well. So, in the same way that Rachel is redeeming the Jewish people in that other story, in this story, it's Miriam redeeming the Jewish people out of this concern for having children, for building a family. And in many ways, that is basically the image of Jewish women for centuries. Now, am I saying that there are no places in Jewish tradition where women were disparaged? Of course there are. In various places. But I could not find a single example where the Jewish mother, prior to the 20th century, is disparaged. These are the images. These are the basic templates. This is the matrix out of which the image of the Jewish mother is constructed. Now, because of that, eventually, the role of the Jewish mother was defined very carefully in Jewish tradition. And here I would mention more broadly. As you may know, the traditional Jewish community was a highly patriarchal Jewish community. It was run by men. Men are all the leaders. Men run the synagogue, men run the Jewish communities. That's just the way it was. You know, learning Torah is a virtue which was reserved only for men. We could say in addition that there was a very sharp division of labor in the Jewish community where public responsibilities, communal responsibilities were the tasks of men. Like I said, the synagogue, the Jewish community, also working for a living, earning and supporting the family. Those were the tasks of men. The Jewish home, that was the domain of women. Which meant that, as part of her portfolio, it was the Jewish mother's responsibility to raise the children. Which also meant that, because it was her responsibility to raise the children, how the children turned out was a reflection on her. So if the children turned out well, she got credit. If they didn't, sometimes, as we shall see, she could be disparaged. Now that's an idealized construct. In reality, the division of labor was never that clear, because there are examples of fathers who helped raise children, And there are examples of women who, for example, worked outside the home and did things like that. There are examples of women being involved in the synagogue, though never in a ritual role. So it's not that clear. But in general, there at least theoretically was that division of labor. Now, the first wrinkle in the story, which leads us to this modern stereotype, we find in Eastern Europe. We're going to jump forward a little bit. In Eastern Europe, in the shtetl, this division of labor between the public and private, between men and women, between fathers and mothers, began to break down a little bit. Not only got blurred, it began to break down for the following reason. As you may know, Eastern European Jewish society was a highly traditional society. Now, it was never as hermetically sealed and perfectly traditional as we're led to believe. It also was a world that wasn't only Jewish. There were lots of non-Jewish people in these worlds. But there were really, because of this traditional feel for the world, I would say a substantial portion of Eastern European Jewish society was either Hasidic, and I mean by Hasidic, maybe the better word than Hasidic would be Hasidish. So even if you weren't a Hasidic Jew, you lived in a very Hasidic milieu and atmosphere. Or it was a non-Hasidic version of Jewish tradition, yeshivish. So you have the Hasidish, you have the yeshivish. Now, in both cases, both of those worlds created the following problem for the Jewish family. If you were a Hasidic man, if you were a man who was Hasidic, then it turns out you spent a considerable amount of time away from your wife, away from your children, away from your home, sitting at the table of the Rebbe, just whatever, eating and listening and singing and whatever. Now, critics of that society often describe that as a gigantic waste of time, but those are critics. We don't have to say that here. But the fact is, that was an example of absenteeism among many Jewish fathers in the shtetl. Now, it wasn't all, but it turns out it was a considerable number. Similarly, if you were in the yeshivish world, oftentimes there were a lot of Jewish fathers who spent a lot of time away from their wives and children and home, sitting in the yeshiva, studying. Whether it was a yeshiva, whether it was a Beit Midrash. Just to give you a sense of this, and I'm not saying this to disparage any institution in our community, there's a program in Detroit called Partners in Torah, which is a wonderful program, where, you go and study a couple of hours a week. But just imagine that Partners in Torah was 7 or 8 hours every day. That's what that yeshiva world was like. And whether you realize it or not, you probably knew about it. If you ever saw Fiddler on the Roof, what is one of Tevye's aspirations if he was a rich man? I discuss the holy books with the learned men 7 hours every day. Is that really what you're going to do with your time, Tevye? No offense, no disrespect, Mr. Tevye. 7 hours? Your children aren't even in school that long. And you have daughters, they don't even go to school. You're not going to spend any time at home. That was the ideal, going to yeshiva. Either way, you had these Jewish fathers away from home. Now keep in mind, they're away from home not because they're working, they're away from home because either they're singing with the Rebbe or they're learning in yeshiva. Now, what do I mean by it altered that division of public versus private? Increasingly in Eastern Europe, especially in 19th century Eastern Europe, at the heyday of the Hasidic and yeshivish world, Jewish mothers were responsible not only for raising the children and managing the home, but also for earning a living. They had to do everything while their husbands were doing, well, not nothing, but they certainly weren't helping out. I would venture to say that for most Jews today, this is not a situation we would stand for. I don't. Maybe some people, I don't know. And part of the problem is the original Hasidic Jew, the Baal Shem Tov, that was their situation. His wife supported him so he could wander in the fields and teach, and whatever, and make no money and have a spiritual life. And that was seen as a kind of ideal. And the original yeshiva scholars were also supported by their wives, which meant that for many Jewish children growing up in Eastern Europe, for extended periods of time, the mother was the only parent they ever saw. It reminds me of another joke, and this is not a Jewish mother joke. This is a joke that reflects that world. Okay? There's a young married couple, and the husband, what he basically does is he spends weeks at a time away at yeshiva. In fact, he spends almost the entire year at the yeshiva. He only comes home once a year on Pesach. So at some point, the rabbi says to him, why don't you come home more often? He says, Rabbi, I come home every year on Pesach, and then 9 months later I have another child. Can you imagine if I came home every week, how many children I would have? But that situation was idealized in certain ways. You have almost no one speaking out against it. What situation I would say was rather unfair. It's not an equal situation where the mother, is given a disproportionate amount or unfair amount of the responsibility. One of the first to really speak out against it was one of the first modern Jews in Eastern Europe. This was a Hebrew poet whose name was Judah Leib Gordon, also known as Yud Lamed Gordon or Yalag. He really, this is a subject for another lecture, but he reinvented Hebrew as a modern literary language. And he wrote about a lot of different things, but he was the first Jewish scholar in Eastern Europe to really speak out on behalf of this unfair situation for the Jewish mother I just described. So let me read you an example of him speaking out. Look at text number 8. We'll come back to text number 7. Text number 8. This is from a poem he wrote called Kotzo Shel Yud, the tip of the Yud, the tip of the Hebrew letter Yud. Now, it's an elaborate story, which I don't have time to go into. I could tell you, maybe talk about it another time. But this is the preface to a story where he's describing the plight of Jewish women in Eastern Europe, and he writes, Isha Ivriya miyeda chayayich, Jewish wife, who shall know your life? It comes in the dark and leaves no mark, your joys and your anguishes, your hopes and your wishes, in your heart born and in your heart worn. The world and all the pleasure for others to treasure, the life of a Jewess is a perpetual grind, forever in her house confined. And listen to this, she bear, deliver, rear and litter, bake and make and wither. This is a devastating profile. But from this poem, what he goes on to say is, we as a Jewish community need to ameliorate the situation of the Jewish woman. And that's something he started, this is in the 1870s. It's something he tried to do. But he was an isolated voice at the time. This image of the Jewish mother as almost a singular parent is one of the realities of Eastern Europe. But keep in mind, the Jewish mother in this situation was not disparaged. She was never called overbearing. She was called tireless. She was called heroic. Let me give you an example of that. In text number 7, this is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who a Lithuanian-born Jewish immigrant who was later one of the leading rabbis of Yeshiva University till he died. He's also a Jewish philosopher. He wrote an essay called Family Redeemed, Essays on Family Relationships. And this is what he said about Jewish mothers versus fathers. Okay? In the natural community, that's his way of saying in the community of people as opposed to heaven, the woman is more concerned with motherhood than the man with fatherhood. Motherhood, in contrast to fatherhood, bespeaks a long, enduring, peculiar state of body and mind. The 9 months of pregnancy, with all its attendant biological and psychological changes, the birth of the child with pain and suffering, the nursing of the baby, and later the caretaking of and attending to the youngster, all form part of the motherhood experience. Physically, fatherhood implies nothing tangible and memorable. The male, bodily and mentally, does not experience his fatherhood, meaning in the same way as a woman experiences motherhood. This is a great, for him, he lauded motherhood. He was also very good to his own wife. In fact, in his home, she was the halachic authority on whether the kitchen was kosher, not him. He respected her deeply. He was kind to her till the day she died. And his own relationship with his own wife, he amplified into this conception of the Jewish mother. Again, very favorable. So then you're wondering, why did it change? Why did it change? What does it have to do with the immigrant experience? What does it have to do with this notion of assimilation? Well, before we get to America, we see a hint of this in Western Europe. Now, I'm going to give you an example, but an example of a place where Jewish assimilation was rapidly advancing. And this is an example from turn of the 20th century Hungary, and more specifically Budapest. Turn of the 20th century Budapest, that Jewish community was rapidly becoming one of the most highly acculturated in the world. Hungarian Jews, they do many things very, very well. Assimilation was also one of them as well. They were very, very good at it. And so a newspaper was published beginning in the year 1901, and this was a Hungarian newspaper called The Hungarian Jewish Woman. On the surface, it kind of looked like Lilith magazine 100 years before, except here's the catch here. This was a newspaper called The Hungarian Jewish Woman, or Women, which pretended to be published by women for women. And when you look at all the list of all the writers, all the names are women. Turns out, though, it was actually a man publishing this, pretending it was women talking to women, but this is actually men talking to women. So there was an essay from 1901 that was called Az Anya, which means the mother, or the Jewish mother. And what does she write? A woman should devote herself to the raising of children. Remember, this is against the backdrop of a world which is rapidly changing. If her children are mature enough to be able to attend synagogue, then it is the mother's duty to bring them there or to have them brought there. The Talmud teaches that it is commendable for mothers to bring their children to synagogue. The moral and modest upbringing of children is entrusted to the mother alone. Now, this sounds like the situation I just described in the shtetl, except this is not a situation which took place because of men were absent, after the fact, or as the result of something, men being absentee. This is a situation which is being celebrated or idealized from the get-go. He's not saying it should only be the mother because the men are away. He's saying, regardless of the situation, women have sole responsibility for taking care of the children. Because women are exempt from ceremonial regulations, much of her time remains to turn her influence toward training of internal religious life. It's the mother's responsibility that the children be raised as good Jews. Thus, the Jewish mother became the primary rearer of future generations. Lately, here's the criticism, an evil fashion arose that children are cared for by paid individuals, nannies. The sidewalks are fraught with children, but where are they, the mothers? In their stead, except in very poor families, unprincipled, insensitive, unmindful menials stay with them, the children, for hours at a time, with no regard for what is beneficial to the child. Now, it's not only talking about Budapest or the situation where things are changing. It's directed at a very specific situation, not only within the Jewish community, but we might say within the larger middle-class community. This is talking about a moment in European society where things are changing. And what is changing especially, there's this new notion, or this new idealized notion of the Jewish mother, that she should stay home. Not only for Jews, this notion was called domesticity. Because the notion that a woman's place is in the home, a woman's domain is in the home, that's a long-standing Jewish notion. The Jewish mother ran the Jewish home. But what's new here at this moment is not that the home is her domain. It's that the home is her only domain. A mother should be home all the time for her children. Now, in some sense, here's the newness of it. Because you may, as you may know, you may not know, that really for centuries, prior to, I would say, mid-19th century Europe, everybody worked, men and women, regardless of social class. If you lived on a farm, that you needed every hand, men and women, sons and daughters, to make the farm work. If you ran a business, everybody had to run the business together. If you were a noble, nobles and their wives ran the estate. Just think in Downton Abbey terms about, the American wife. She's not sitting around doing nothing. She's busy all the time. Everybody worked until when we have the emergence of an affluent or propertied middle class, suddenly these were situations where you had upperly mobile men who for the first time in their lives could earn enough money to support the family themselves, and they got into their mind that a measure of their success was their wives not having to work. So this notion that women should only be at home. This is a 19th century middle class bourgeois notion of domesticity. And the Jews we just read about in Budapest, these are Jews who are, this writer is not speaking really from a Jewish point of view. He's not speaking based on a long history of the Jewish community and the role of the mother there. He's speaking from a middle class, a bourgeois point of view. Mothers should be home. Mothers should be taking care of their children. Now, this was a difficult situation for many Jewish mothers. It wasn't difficult to do it, but it was difficult because if you had some affluence, if you could afford domestic servants, for example, you had the time and the ability to raise the children and do other things, to take care of the house and do other things, but suddenly you have this value which is saying no, and this is the beginning. This is maybe a preliminary stage of judging the Jewish mother harshly. This is one of the earliest instances we have which says that these Jewish mothers, by handing off their children to nannies, are forsaking their role. They may even say forsaking a sacred role. They're supposed to be raising the children. Why are they not raising the children? They're supposed to be at home. Elsewhere in this same essay, he says women should not be going out in public at night. Women shouldn't be going to clubs or coffee houses. They should be home with the children. That sharp role differentiation between men and women and a woman's places in the home is that 19th century invention. Now, this is really laying a foundation, because the Jews being described in that essay, these are Jews who are becoming part of a larger world. This process of Jews becoming part of a larger world is even more pronounced and more profound in America. Because it was in America where Jews, most of whom are coming from a very traditional world in Eastern Europe, are encountering an open society on this scale for the first time. Most Jews who came from Europe to America had never seen and never lived in a society, in a mainstream society, which was so welcoming of Jews, where there were such possibilities. And of course, they began to explore them. And this is the moment when we get some angst. And this is the moment when we begin to see the disparaging image of the Jewish mother. Now let me make clear how it happens. In those immigrant generations, that first generation of Jewish immigrants who came here, let's see it from the vantage point of men, sons of Jewish mothers. The goal was to make it in America, which meant to work hard, to go to school, to learn English, to make a better life for your own children. And as we saw in those earlier examples, Jewish mothers were the supportive ones there. When we're talking about first-generation Jewish immigrants struggling to make it in America, what they needed was support, unconditional support, because it was very difficult to make it in America. If you want an example of that, if you ever read, there's a novel called Call It Sleep by Henry Roth. Now it's a complicated story, so the mother in that story is obviously not perfect, Genya. But the father is this aloof, absentee guy, and we eventually find out why that is. So I guess he's a little sympathetic by the end. He wants nothing to do with this son, partly because he's not sure if it's his. But the mother, and this son is getting into having all kinds of problems and adventures. She is the one who stands by him throughout. This is an immigrant novel in which the mother is painted in supportive and very positive terms. Not perfect by any stretch, but it's a positive portrayal. But in the second generation, when it becomes possible to really not only make it in America, but to become American, and more importantly, and here's the key, the possibility of leaving one's Jewish identity behind, becoming less and less Jewish, here we get the notion here we get a kind of uncertainty among second-generation Jewish immigrants. How much am I allowed to become American? How much Jewishness am I allowed to leave behind? There's a kind of confusion there, or tension, or uncertainty, or ambivalence. Choose your word. And the question is, well, we have two things going against each other. There's the urge to become American, to make it an American society, but there's an equally powerful urge not to cut oneself off too much from the Jewish community and from one's own Jewish identity. And here's where the Jewish mother, or the image of the Jewish mother, or even the reality of the Jewish mother, starts to become problematic and starts to be disparaged. Because think about it. Think about it. We've already established, who is it? Which parent is it who is responsible for raising a good Jew, for raising a good child? It's the mother. Which is the one who's going to have the most problem with leaving one's Jewish identity or leaving the Jewish community? It's the mother, because she has been assigned the responsibility for centuries of making sure her children grow up Jewish and remain Jewish. And so now when you have this generation, this second generation of Jews coming of age and contemplating entering American society, the mother is presented as an impediment. The mother is presented as an anchor. Now, a generation earlier, the anchor was very reassuring because it was so overwhelming. But in this generation, the anchor is holding them back. I can make it in America. I can become as American as everybody else if it wasn't for my mother. My mother is holding me back. And here we see the more negative stereotype of the Jewish mother. Let me give you an example. We've got to have an example here. And there's no better example of the stereotypically disparaged Jewish mother than Sophie Portnoy. That's the mother from Portnoy's Complaint. This is Alexander Portnoy's mother. This is a novel by Philip Roth, who, look, I never met Philip Roth, but I can only imagine this guy must have had neuroses just coming out of his ears. And, well, and he writes about them. I think he writes about them really well, but if you're looking for these clear-cut or crude stereotypes, well, let's read it. This is text number 10. Right from the beginning of the story, it's one of the first things Alexander Portnoy says in Portnoy's Complaint. She, meaning my mother, his mother, Sophie, she was so deeply embedded in my consciousness that for the first year of school, I seemed to have believed that each of my teachers was my mother in disguise. He couldn't imagine an important adult not being his mother. As soon as the last bell had sounded, I would rush off for home, wondering as I ran if I could possibly make it to our apartment before she had succeeded in transforming herself. In other words, back from the teacher. Invariably, she was already in the kitchen by the time I arrived and setting out my milk and cookies. Instead of causing me to give up my delusions, however, the feat merely intensified my respect for her powers. And then it was always a relief not to have caught her between incarnations anyway. So the mother here is all-powerful, is this supernatural being. Now, if that had been the tone of the novel all the way through, that wouldn't have been so bad. But this is the beginning of Alexander Portnoy's journey toward becoming an American boy, American young man, an American man. And his mother is the one who basically has a rope around him, or a leash almost, and keeps tugging back. In his mind, and remember, this is in his mind, and we can see the author here. Most people who read Philip Roth, he's really projecting a lot of himself into his characters. This is Philip Roth saying, I'm going to become a successful American writer if only my mother would let me. If only she would stay out of my way. And this is where all the stereotypes come. She loves me so much, she's smothering me. She loves me so much, she's hovering. This is where a loving mother becomes an overly loving mother, right in this moment. And it isn't just Portnoy, Alexander Portnoy. It's this whole generation. There's a perception, or I would say an image of young men trying to make it who feel tethered. If only they could untether themselves. But clearly it's difficult to untether yourself because your whole childhood you've been raised to believe, or you've come to believe, that your mother is this superhuman, larger-than-life force that you can't live without. And there's the confusion. There's the ambivalence. I can't live without my mother, but I can't live with my mother. I can't have a full life without her. I can't have a full life with her. There it is in a nutshell. Now, this is a stereotype which really becomes entrenched probably by in the 1930s and the 1940s. Portnoy's complaint is a little bit later. This is a fully developed version. The literature written, we can make such a contrast. We can make a list of immigrant Jewish novels where the mother is not only the hero, the mother is just the kindest, supportive person, and then a generation later, these novels that are written from the 1940s or 50s on, suddenly that nurturing mother becomes the smothering mother, and the kind mother becomes the overbearing mother, and the caring mother becomes the overly intrusive mother. All the stereotypes come into place. If you want to put a timetable on it, it really crystallizes in post-war America. That's really the moment in the 40s and 50s where American Jews are really coming of age as the American part of being an American Jew. That's where it's really coming of age. Now, fortunately, the story does not end there, because in the same way that this negative, disparaging image of the Jewish mother was a backlash to something, it itself elicited another backlash. But first we have to note one more element of it as well, because an alternative dimension of criticizing the Jewish mother didn't only come from men like Philip Roth. It also came from women who themselves were becoming feminist. Now, not all. Some, because they perceive, in the same way that men perceive that their mothers were holding them back from making it America, some Jewish feminists said, I would love to really be a part of this, but it's going to kill my mother if I do this, if I embrace these ideas, if I don't want to be a housewife. There's someone like Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique. One of the things she notes in her own formative upbringing, one of the difficulties of writing The Feminine Mystique, is she felt at certain points that she was betraying her own mother by challenging the norm of a woman as a housewife and a mother who that whole thing. She felt like it was difficult for her to move beyond it. Now, she did and helped other women do it as well, but it wasn't that easy. It was another version of feeling tethered by the Jewish mother. And let's recall, the reason none of this has to do with the Jewish father is because we're talking about a situation where the Jewish father was largely not there. I mean, if there's one subtext here, if there's one, additional lesson here, it's the Jewish mother becomes a lightning rod of something, but the reason she becomes a lightning rod is because she's the one who is there, more so than the Jewish father, at least in this idealized sense of the way things are working. But we get, out of some of these same feminist writers, we get the beginnings of a kind of backlash, or a kind of rethinking that disparaging image. Let's look at text number 11. This is an essay written by Anne Roif, who wrote an essay, an early book, a feminist book called "Fruitful: A Real Mother in the Modern World." Okay. Now, there's a lot here, but let's take a look at what it says. She says, quote, "My son, the doctor, became a nasty joke. All of my friends," my son, the doctor, is sort of, that's where the Jewish mother takes great pride. She talks about my son, the doctor. That actually reminds me of a funny comedy routine by Larry David. Larry David, one of his first comedy routines was, he always talks about Jonas Salk. That's the guy who cured polio, right? Jonas Salk. He always said that, wouldn't Jonas Salk's mother have been very difficult to talk to? Because she's always bragging about her son, and normally you'd say, what's so good about him? What did he do, cure polio or something like that? If you're Jonas Salk's mother, well, yeah, it's very difficult. My son, the doctor, becomes this is the great joy of the Jewish mother. It's the stereotypical mantra of the Jewish mother. So what is Anne Roif, right? My son, the doctor, became a nasty joke. All my friends were complaining about their own mothers, how pathetic their lives were. Remember, this is her circle of feminist women in the 1960s. How pathetic their lives were, how they hovered,
how they wasted their time dusting the furniture, how boring, how they had limited their daughters while encouraging their sons. Everyone had a version of the bitter tale to tell. Sometimes it seemed as if we were engaged in an Olympic competition to decide whose mother was absolutely the worst. Now, she's saying this as a point of departure of questioning the validity of that stereotype, but it gives us a sense of how deeply entrenched it is. It wasn't just sons trying to break away from their mother. In this case, these are daughters who are trying to break away from their mothers as well. More powerfully, I think, is in text number 12. Now, Grace Paley is an important American Jewish writer. She is really part of that American Jewish canon of the 20th century. And she wrote an essay in Esquire magazine in 1975 called Mom. It's a terrific essay. By the way, you can read the whole thing online. Here's one short excerpt. She was destined, with her meaty bossiness, her size, or suffering, to be dumped into the villain room of social meaning and psychological causation. So here she's kind of reiterating the stereotype. Bossy, suffering, and villainized. When this happened to her, she had just touched the first run of the great immigrant ladder. Sorry, that should be D's. Her husband was ahead of her, or intentional bulk. Her intentional bulk kept her from slipping. No typos. Kept her from slipping. In other words, the image is they're all climbing the immigrant ladder together. She is making it possible for her husband to climb, and she's the one who's going to catch him if he falls. The children were a couple of rungs above them. She believed she would follow them up into the English language, education, and respect. So here Grace Paley is describing that Jewish mothers had the same expectation in America as everybody else. Everyone's becoming American. Everyone's embracing this alternative culture. Everyone's, somewhat carelessly or unselfconsciously moving away from an older traditional world. And she thought she was going to get it too. And here's a great line. Unfortunately, science and literature turned against her. What does she mean by that? What you said was my accumulating affection. Just a minute. What you said was my accumulating affection when the brains of the opposition included her son, the doctor, and her son, the novelist. Oh, what would you say when her accumulating affection to her accumulating affection when the brains of the opposition included her son, the doctor, and her son, the novelist? In other words, who are those who are most disparaging of the Jewish mother? Her son, the doctor, who is trying to make it for himself but feels held back by his Jewish mother? Or her son, the writer, like Philip Roth, who is describing the mother in such disparaging terms? Because of them, she never even had a chance at the crown of apple pie awarded her American-born sisters and accepted by them when they agreed to give up their power for pioneer dispositions. Grace Paley is talking to an irony here. The Jewish mother is working tirelessly to help her husband, her sons, her daughters make it in America. She is the one, and this is Grace Paley saying in earnest, she is the one making my son the doctor possible, but my son the doctor turns on her. Or my son the writer, she made possible. She sacrificed for him. She gave up her own chance to make it in America. And what do they mean by she's not allowed to do it? Because the Jews who made it, the Jews who became more Americanized, oftentimes took comfort in the fact that the mothers remained old-fashioned and traditional. The mothers would keep the faith, so it doesn't matter if I do. I can drift because the mothers will as well. And a young man would say, my mother will take care of it, and when I get married, my wife will take care of it, and she'll make sure the children are Jewish. Now, like we noted before, that this responsibility for the mother had been something that was celebrated for a very long time. The veneration of the Jewish mother she was the one who took charge of the raising of children. She was the one who perpetuated. Jewish mothers for centuries were these latter-day Rachels. who made sure that Jews were redeemed generation after generation, that they weren't destroyed. There's a lot of credit given here. But here in the 20th century, amidst the angst of assimilating into America, suddenly those same characteristics, that same behavior by the Jewish mother is now seen as something wrong and villainized and unproductive and an impediment to personal fulfillment. But then Grace Paley comes and says, but that's not fair. And this essay, Mom, in retrospect, in 1975, is already 40 years ago. From the time she published this essay, this is when we really begin to see a rethinking of the image of the Jewish mother. So it doesn't go away. I mean, stereotypically, we still see the Jewish mother, especially in comedy. Because something very interesting happens. At the moment when Grace Paley is writing this essay, in the early 1970s, this is when this image of the Jewish mother, which has already been familiar to Jews for a couple of generations, becomes a much broader stereotype. This is when you begin to see it on a grander scale in television and movies. If you look at those Jewish mother types on television, where you really begin to see this character, this stereotypical Jewish mother, is in the 1970s. I'll give you an example. You remember the show Rhoda? You remember Rhoda? Rhoda's mother was an early example, not only of not so much the first overbearing Jewish mother, but the first overbearing Jewish mother in which that's really all she was. You see, yes, there was the Goldbergs, the Goldbergs before, and Mrs. Goldberg in some ways could be that stereotypical Jewish mother, but she also had redeeming characteristics. Rhoda's mother, her whole purpose on the show was to nag Rhoda about the way she looked, to remind her and her sister repeatedly that they were not married, and when are you going to get married? Now, another dimension of this, and someone who in her own way built on Grace Paley's defense of the Jewish mother, because Grace Paley, make no mistake, this essay, Mom, is a defense of Jewish mothers against these claims. In a kind of comedic parallel way, we have Joan Rivers. Because Joan Rivers, as a comedian, is going to present herself and her mother, well, first her mother, and then later herself, as the quintessential Jewish mother. But as a comedian, she is going to hold it up, and she is going to mock it, by which she lays bare how thin the stereotype is, and the fact that it's really not that true. By turning it into comedy, in some ways, you can neutralize a stereotype in that way. The upshot is, and where we really find ourselves right now is, the stereotype still lingers. Something that's this deeply entrenched, a combination of an older, venerated image of the Jewish mother with that particular negative spin put on it in America. It's not disappeared. It's still around. But I think the good news is that as we move forward, the situation begins to change. And one of the things I think that's altered the situation the most, in the most fundamental way, and I say this in retrospect, even though there's not much retrospect because it's a relatively recent development, is that the phenomena of shared parenting, where it is no longer, in more and more cases, it's no longer the mother doing all the child rearing and the father going off to work outside the home every day. Now there's more sharing for a variety of reasons. There's no longer this expectation that the man somehow has to earn all the money, otherwise he's a failure, or that if a woman leaves the home, she's a failure or has to make some kind of choice. And with this shared responsibility, this increasingly frequent shared responsibility, the image of the Jewish mother is in many ways, I think, beginning to dissipate. I wouldn't say it's disappearing, but it certainly is beginning to diminish. And more, the stereotype of the Jewish mother is something associated with an older generation. That's not this generation as much as is an older generation. Yes, there are still overbearing parents, but more recently, and certainly if you look at more recent comedic examples in television and movies and novels, it's not so much about overbearing Jewish mothers anymore. It's about overbearing Jewish parents, but it's sort of equal to fathers and mothers. Fathers, by being more present, have also acquired the right to be mocked as being overbearing. And so we don't hear the expression helicopter mothers as much as we hear helicopter or hovering parents. We don't hear snowplow mothers, we hear snowplow parents. So, look, the problem of Jewish parents, or the problem of parents being overly hovering is still around, but it isn't as much focused specifically on the Jewish mother anymore. The Jewish mother stereotype was tied to a specific moment and a specific set of circumstances. As those circumstances change, the stereotype of the Jewish mother changes and dissipates with it. Thank you very much.